to my series of conversations with men and women as ideas, vision and philosophy help define our contemporary world. My guest today has played a key catalytic role in defining those agendas and has been in the news particularly in recent weeks. He heads the Intergovernmental Panel of the United Nations Environment Programme and the World Meteorological Organization looking at climate change. He's the Director General of the Energy Resource Institute, TERI, and has served in numerous government of India, international United Nations and other organizations as a leading environmentalist who has, with passion and commitment, helped chart the course and the strategies of planning and addressing global environmental issues. He's authored more than 20 books, several hundreds of articles and essays. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. R.K. Pachauri. You have really grabbed global headlines in recent weeks with the Intergovernmental Panel report. Before we come to the report itself, much of it is already in the press. I think that we've often missed the fact that it has been a remarkable achievement in consensus building, that you've had more than 2,500 scientists, 100-odd committees and 130 countries. What was that challenge? Because obviously, the science also has ideological, political affiliations in a sense. To bring to this all of them together and evolve a consensus has been a great achievement.
Well, I may be speaking too soon, or I would say you may be speaking too soon, because we still have 2 more reports to bring out. We're only sort of halfway there. But I would say that the credit really goes to the system and the tradition that's been established in the IPCC, where people work together and people coming from different parts of the world and experts in their respective subjects. So I think there's a lot of momentum, there's a great deal of tradition, culture in the organization which brings about this kind of outcome.
Well, that's sort of, I think, a very sort of institutional, polite response. But there must have been inherently, serious challenges to several issues, because there are different perceptions, at least in the public domain, that different governments have. Governments fund scientists. There are those complex web of relationships. So what were some of the most difficult issues to resolve?
Well, I mean, you really have difficulties all the way, but there is enough resource, enough desire to solve these major issues by which one can move ahead. I mean, quite apart from the scientific community, which necessarily has a wide range of perspectives and views as well as assessments about a complex subject like climate change. There are also all these governments, and everything we do, right from the stage of defining the outline of a report and the topics that go into it to its final acceptance, really is subject to the approval of so many governments.
Are there any exclusions that you would have liked to have seen that need to have featured and perhaps haven't because there wasn't a consensus?
Not really, because I think by and large the whole process is driven by the scientists and the authors who work on the report. Yes, they have to justify, they have to defend whatever they put into a report, but I haven't seen a single case of something major being thrown out just because governments didn't want it. Because let's remember that there are various governments that are present over there, and it's not as though 1 or 2 can hijack the process, because it's a very transparent and open discussion that takes place. And the force of consensus building requires that people do have to conform to the larger view that's expressed by everybody. You really can't be too much of an outlier. So, it's not as though someone has so much muscle that they can literally ignore the voices of, say, 130 or 140 different countries.
There is this sort of a great sense of alarm, a momentum, at least in civil society, in the media, that has been generated on the issue. But there's also a great deal of cynicism that sort of believes that ultimately it is political, economic imperatives that tend to dominate actions on the issue, and that despite the sort of the processes of democracy, that we're not always able to influence substantially and significantly decision making, and that major publications, some of them have taken contrarian views and said, well, this is civilizational, and the Earth has been warming up since the Ice Age anyway, so what's the panic, and maybe we'll have sea resorts in Iceland one of these, in the not too distant future. So how is this momentum likely to be translated into the kind of action that people like you would like to see?
Well, I think the key determinant of action would really be the perceptions on the part of the public. If the public realizes the gravity of climate change and all that's associated with it, then certainly this will translate into pressure on governments throughout the world. There's no getting away from the fact that there are some who are going to suffer far worse than others. You mentioned the possibility of sea resorts, sunny resorts in Iceland. Well, yes, there might be some such spots on the earth that at least for the next 2 or 3 decades may live in the illusion of benefiting from climate change. But on the other hand, there are several societies who really are going to be without recourse to even the basics of a healthy existence. And we need to be concerned about it. So, I'd like to highlight the equity dimensions of this whole problem. It's not as though we don't have countries that are already suffering at a level which should cause concern.
Your report is exhaustive, it's detailed. Press a few buttons for us between right from the changing weather patterns that we will have. The monsoons will be erratic, the rivers will overflow, there will be drought, the prices of cereals will go up. There are so many different issues that come up. What for you are the sort of, say, 3 most alarming and the buttons that you'd really like to press? And as the sort of the centerpiece, the chairperson of this report, what would you focus attention on?
Well, I would certainly focus attention on sea level rise, which is obviously going to impact perhaps not just a few millions of people, tens of millions of people. So that's something to be concerned about.
Give us a time frame that because again, we tend to think, well, this is going to happen in a few hundred years, and let's not think about it.
No, it's not going to be a few hundred years, because the range that we have projected for sea level rise by the end of this century could go up to close to 60 centimeters, which is a pretty huge increase. That's the upper end. Of course, it could be lower than that. Now, if that's the case, there are some small island states, several coastal areas, including our own Sundarbans, for instance, which would be extremely vulnerable. So, sea level rise is something to worry about. I would say the whole issue of water scarcity across different parts of this planet.
You're talking about melting glaciers and the impact of that downstream.
That's one factor, but the other factor also is changes in precipitation. Now, there's likelihood that subtropical and tropical areas will get much less rain overall, but at the same time, they will have many more extreme precipitation events, which means that overall we'll get less rainfall, but most of it will occur during short and concentrated periods, which means that you won't really be able to store it, you won't really be able to make the best use of it. And this clearly means that the entire infrastructure for management of our water resources will need to be redesigned, will need to be strengthened and revamped.
We'll come to more of that in a moment. You're watching a conversation with Dr. R.K. Pachauri, leading environmentalist, most recently in the news as chairperson of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. We'll be right back after a short break. Don't go away. Welcome back to a continuing conversation with Dr. R.K. Pachauri on his report on climate change. Tell us the implications of these sort of changing patterns of rainfall and short bursts of rain. Connect that for us to what consequences will it have and how will it affect us?
Well, those consequences are pretty straightforward. Firstly, those who are dependent on rain-fed agriculture would naturally be affected, because if there's going to be a decline, total quantum of rainfall that's received, that clearly translates into lower output as far as agriculture is concerned. And these are people, who are really living at the edge, and they would really find it very, very difficult.
Could we take that a step further to make it real to our everyday experience? So that means shortage of food, rise in prices. What kind of shortages? What kind of rises? I mean, I know that's a tough call. I mean, we're in the middle of inflation and everybody is groaning about price rises anyway. But just sort of, let's put a figure at it so it becomes more real.
I mean, what I would say is that we are really dealing with stresses that are there already. I mean, we are living in a world where food shortages, several people have warned us, are going to become very common in the future, simply because in several parts of the world we've reached a plateau as far as agricultural yields are concerned, and demand is going up rapidly, not only because of population increase but also because of rising incomes and people moving from vegetable protein to animal protein. So that requires much more grain, particularly for organized production of meat and meat products, poultry, etc. So I would say that for a country like India, if you're looking at 500 million people who are dependent on rain-fed agriculture, if there is a decline even to the extent of 10% in a particular year, that's something pretty serious, because this really means that people who are already living on the margins are now going to have 10% less. And what's more, in some cases, some people may be left completely high and dry. They won't be able to produce anything during a particular year. What happens socially? I mean, this would be terribly disruptive in terms of people who are barely getting 2 square meals a day today, not being able to provide that, moving into towns and cities just to pick up some jobs and to create an enormous amount of social disruption.
Isn't there a risk or the difficulty in advocacy for the agendas that you're talking about, that the process seems so gradual and incremental that it isn't sort of like, a tsunami or a hurricane that the United States is now anticipating 9 in the remaining part of the year, that comes dramatically and suddenly, and then we all sort of wake up. What are some of the dramatic events that we're likely to see over the next, say, decade that will make us sit up, rather than the gradual unfolding, which is serious enough but doesn't catalyze action in the manner that, say, a tsunami does?
I wouldn't want to link, let's say, an event such as the heat wave in Europe in 2003, or even the heat wave we had in Andhra the same year, to human-induced climate change. But that's the kind of thing that could become far more frequent. If you have 30,000 deaths in Europe during a heat wave, surely that's a major disaster. It's the equivalent of at least a mini tsunami, if not the type that we suffered 2 years ago. If you look at the flood that occurred in Mumbai almost 2 years ago, that again is something which is a terribly disastrous event. Now, things like this, if they are going to happen, and if the public understands that the trend in the increase of frequency and intensity of these events is linked to human-induced climate change, then obviously they're going to look for solutions. So what I'm saying is that firstly, there's an acceleration of trends in climate change, which is very, very clearly brought out by our report. Secondly, the probability of these extreme events is going up. All of that really translates into disaster, and if that also gets accompanied by reduction in agricultural output, growing scarcity of water. We already have disputes between the states of India fighting over the sharing of river waters. What if that was to multiply across the country? Now, surely that's, to my mind, disaster of a much greater magnitude than even a tsunami, because these problems don't go away easily. A tsunami comes and goes. Yes, it damages and harms a lot of lives and takes away a lot of lives, but what we're talking about is something that is going to stay with us. And surely that's a much bigger disaster than something that occurs over a few hours.
I think there's a fair degree of global consensus on the nature of the problem. I mean, there may be some variation. Some people may think it's over a longer period of time, shorter period of time, civilizational or whatever, but But I think sort of ultimately, the debate and the confusion or the conflict, as it were, is really in what will constitute appropriate, feasible, implementable solutions. So, I mean, you're a scientist, and there is the view that, look, science will find a solution to the issue. And from far-fetched, like putting mirrors in the skies to reflect the sun out, to more everyday solutions to a major organization said, well, we should all use CFL bulbs, and that is going to so dramatically reduce the consumption of energy. Of course, there are problems with that. I mean, where do in Indian villages with the quality of power supply, you can't exactly use CFL bulbs. As a scientist, to what degree does science have the potential to deliver solutions? And even as I ask this question, we will come to the notion of what the individual can do, the ethical, moral, spiritual imperatives. But what is the potential of science?
Well, science has enormous potential, there's no question about it, but science cannot function in isolation of policy, and it can't function in let's say, in a distance from market as well as public demand. So, we need to create that demand for science and scientific solutions. And that has to be done through the market. It has to be done by regulatory policies and other government actions, incentives, disincentives. And all of this should work towards reducing what one calls the gap between private cost and social cost. Today, let's say the consumption of fossil fuels incurs a certain amount of private cost, but the social cost it imposes, both in terms of local pollution as well as something on a global scale, as we see in the case of climate change, is huge. There's a big gap between the two. So I think our pricing system and our policies that are followed, let's say, through regulation or fiscal incentives and disincentives, must bridge this gap. It's only then that technology would respond. I mean, you can't get solar devices which will convert solar energy to electricity at the cost that we have today, or let's say better costs and more attractive costs in the future, unless there is a policy imperative to bring that about.
But plainly, as the efforts in the Kyoto Protocol and in other such efforts have demonstrated, that perhaps your task in the intergovernmental agency has been easier in defining the problem than it has been for governments to get together and decide on what action they need to take. And in an interdependent world, it isn't enough for particular countries to be able to act on these issues. But we'll come to that in a moment. You're watching a conversation with Dr. R.K. Pachauri, environmentalist and chairperson of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Don't go away. Welcome back to a continuing conversation with Dr. R.K. Pachauri. We were talking about this issue of being able to bring the world together to find solutions. And of course, one of them is this, is the aspect of perhaps the need to go back to focusing on the moral, spiritual, ethical imperatives, particularly for those countries, individuals who are contributing in larger per capita measure, perhaps, to this process. India is less than, a quarter of the global average still. How do we begin to convince the United States, which is usually the country that we wave the red flag about, to act?
Well, let me first say that the fact that the IPCC does not prescribe any solutions really gives us the kind of credibility we have. If we started doing that, we would be the subject of a lot of controversy, we would be the subject of a lot of criticism coming from quarters that feel that we are sort of fighting their interests, and there are all kinds of vested interests in this business. So the fact that we are a scientific agency that only gives you the facts, the truth, the assessment of climate change in its entirety gives us some measure of credibility, which I think we would have lost if we got into the action part. Fortunately, there's another body to take care of the action, and that's the Secretariat of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and there again all the governments of the world are involved. Now, how do you bring about action? I think, as I said earlier, basically if we tell people and explain to them the implications of climate change on a strong and credible scientific basis, I think it will create the conditions by which people at large, and therefore leaders who are responsible to them, will start looking for solutions and will articulate measures by which, if those solutions don't exist today, will at least be around tomorrow and can
But,
be
you had
created.
mentioned equity, and I think that isn't this the sort of the real problem, that if the victims are going to be Bangladesh, India, and sort of other poor countries, that our efforts to pressurize our own governments aren't exactly as effective as the efforts of the citizens of the countries which are who have much higher per capita consumption of energy, for them to be able to influence their governments to act. And so we have a fundamental inequity here, and where does that impetus to action to bring it together?
Well, that's where I think it's very important to explain to people around the world, and I think we are succeeding to some extent in doing that. The fact that there really won't be any winners in this. I mean, whether you talk of North America or Europe or Asia, the fact is the impacts of climate change, diverse as they are, will be of harm in several respects, both economically, socially, and to every individual that forms that is a part of society. So I think we necessarily have to see that at the international level, awareness grows to a point where people start telling their governments what to do. Also, there is an international forum in which governments of India, Bangladesh, and so on can take part, and this is a multilateral forum under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, where I think the developing countries have been successful to some extent, but I think they need to do much more. On the other hand, I believe more and more that it's also important for us in the developing countries to take some of the steps that are in our own interests and that do not in any way minimize opportunities for economic growth and development. And I'm talking about greater use of renewable energy, greater use of public transport, building structures that are energy efficient, and so on. All of this is good for us anyway, but we can use this as a basis to tell the rest of the world, look, we are part of the solution, we are not part of the problem, you are part of the problem unless you start taking some measures effectively. So I think we really need to work at several levels and on different planes.
Isn't perhaps the most difficult challenge, you'd mentioned the markets. The market is the dominant global ideology, is the driving force of what happens. And till such time as perhaps there is a large enough market for cleaning up the environment, and then that may begin to drive this, that we're going to have to struggle with these processes. Because even with market-driven solutions, we have this, the whole notion of carbon credits, not just between nations, but you read about the Oscar ceremonies, and then someone says, okay, this is carbon credit, and for the energy we've consumed, we will pay someone an X amount of money to take care of the damage we've done. Let's talk about each time you fly in an aeroplane that you put about a certain amount of money. And then the question happens, what happens with the money? You plant trees. There's even a report that says, well, planting trees everywhere isn't such a good thing, and that you need to plant trees in particular areas for them to really make a difference. So there is both sort of confusion that you can write a check to get out of your moral, ethical, whatever obligations, and the other aspect is that we spent decades being told, plant trees, it doesn't matter. They're going to serve a great purpose. And someone comes around and says, well, hey, wait a minute. Be careful where you're planting them.
Well, if you take this country, for instance, I really don't see any part of the country where planting a tree would have any negative effects whatsoever. It can have nothing but benefits. But yes, there are a lot of naive solutions that people indulge in, possibly as a salve to their conscience. But may I say that if you look at what might work in the market, I think one measure that could make a lot of difference is a carbon tax. If there's a carbon tax attached to all kinds of fuels, for instance, then clearly the ones that are most carbon intensive are the ones that are going to be unfavorably placed, and that will lead to the development of technologies and solutions that are moving in a direction towards lower carbon intensity. And I think it's time that we started debating some of these measures, not just at the national level but at the international level.
Beyond sort of the rational, someone who's engaged so intimately at so many levels in the issues of the environment, do you have the faith that in 10, 20, whatever number of years, that we will begin to significantly slow down the process, if not arrest it? That may be a bit utopian at this point. And what is that faith based on?
The faith is based on what you said at the start of the program. There is so much interest. There is such a huge response to the facts that we have brought out in our report. And my feeling is that this will lead to a very strong resolve, and I think you will get a snowballing effect. It's important that it's an intelligent initiative that the world sort of starts taking. But given the fact that there is a great deal of knowledge now, not only on the problem but the solutions that might help us address the problem, my belief is that political leaders, those who form the opinion as far as the public is concerned, are going to get very active. And more than anything else, I have great faith in children. If you talk to youngsters today, they are so concerned and generally so well informed about issues like climate change that I think they are going to be the main drivers of action and change in the future.
Well, I think the children of the world will owe Uncle Pachauri a pat on the back. Thank you very much. This has been a great pleasure, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.